Thanks, Concola. Minister, I think we have to be very careful not to be quick to side with the US, as happened in Libya, and I think our role in the EU is going to be an important one. I think it's ironic that the US and the EU talk about illegal invasions, and we've had Deputy Dowds talking about Russia's unacceptable aggression. It seems to me that they've learned too well from the US in terms of unacceptable aggression to other countries and have probably picked up that message. The reality here is that the tragic situation in the Ukraine has been triggered in part by the EU and NATO's drive to expand into the east. That is a fact, in my opinion. The EU's offer to the Ukraine was not a fair one. It was inherently divisive and in some ways drove Yanukovych to be more dependent on Russia. As the Minister is aware, large parts of the Ukraine were previously Russian territories and not part of historic Ukraine. So you had a very vulnerable situation there anyway. Recently, the decision to outlaw or to scrap the law allowing the Russian language to be official has caused a lot of concern and obviously destabilised the situation further. Now, this is a really serious scenario. In my opinion, I think the Russian-speaking majority in part of the region is as angry with the elite and corruption as is concerned about unemployment and economic stability as are people in western Ukraine. But a clumsy intervention, if you like, is not going to sort that out. There's no doubt Yanukovych was corrupt, absolutely, but he was elected, and I have to say, looking at the billionaires and millionaires in the new government, you can take it that corruption will not be ended by this new lot. I think a lot of the organisers behind the protests that ousted Yanukovych are clearly far-right elements with clearly an anti-Semitic agenda and so on. And I think if we're to play a credible role as a neutral country, then we have to look at the record of, if you like, neoliberal shock therapy and privatisation that's going on behind the scenes and destabilising this country, and there will not be a solution by a clumsy EU intervention in this one.
Thank you. Minister, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Last Concola. I welcome the opportunity to respond to both deputies on what is, as Deputy Dowd said, the worst crisis which Europe has faced since the end of the Cold War. Both the EU and the government have strongly condemned Russia's actions over the weekend and call on it to immediately withdraw troops to their barracks. Their actions are in clear breach of international law and of their obligations to respect Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. Yesterday, the Taoiseach had a meeting with the Russian ambassador to Ireland, in which he expressed Ireland's condemnation of actions in Crimea and requested that the Russian ambassador convey our deep concern to his government. On Monday, the Foreign Affairs Council held an extraordinary meeting to discuss the unfolding events in Ukraine. A comprehensive set of conclusions was adopted. The EU wants to see a peaceful solution and stands ready to engage in talks with all parties to resolve this crisis. We will work with the United Nations and the OSCE to facilitate a peaceful resolution of this very dangerous and volatile situation. However, at Monday's Emergency Council, the EU sent a very strong message to Russia. If Russian authorities do not de-escalate this crisis, the EU will take consequential action, including suspending talks on visa liberalisation and on a new economic agreement, both of which are priorities for the Russian government. Foreign ministers will continue to monitor this situation very closely, and we stand ready to implement further measures if necessary. To underline the seriousness of this situation, the European Council will meet tomorrow to consider the matter and our response further. It is worth recalling that it was the announcement on the 21st of November last year by Ukraine's President Yanukovych of his decision to postpone preparations for the signature of the association agreement at November's Eastern Partnership Summit in Vilnius that triggered major protests in Ukraine. The initial protests were overwhelmingly peaceful, yet were met just over a week later by heavy-handed police action, which only served to inflame the situation. The issue has featured prominently in the agendas and conclusions of successive Foreign Affairs Councils this year, including at emergency council sessions devoted to Ukraine on the 20th of February and again earlier this week. I believe that it was right for the Council to convene these sessions, given the violent clashes between protesters and security forces, which resulted in so many deaths, coupled with the deeply disturbing developments in Crimea since last weekend. The situation remains extremely dangerous, though thankfully there are no reports yet of armed forces between Russia, of clashes between armed forces of Russia and Ukraine so far. The Taoiseach made clear there is an urgent need for Moscow to de-escalate the situation. The Council agreed the conclusions agreed at Monday's meeting strongly condemned the violation of Ukrainian sovereignty, and we agreed that these actions are in clear breach of the UN Charter and the OSCE Helsinki Final Act, as well as of Russia's specific commitments to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity under the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 and the Bilateral Treaty on Friendship, Cooperation and Partnership of 1997. We call on Russia to immediately withdraw its armed forces to the areas of the permanent stationing in accordance with the agreement on the status and conditions of the Black Sea Fleet stationed on the territory of Ukraine of 1997. We also commend the government in Kiev for their measured response demonstrated so far in the face of this provocation. The EU stands ready to facilitate a political settlement. However, this is ultimately a matter for the people of Ukraine, as they must do so and decide on their own future. The organisation of democratic elections in May, which are transparent, free and fair, will provide them with an opportunity to make that decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Dowds, a minute.
To thank the Minister for his response. Could I ask just 2 or 3 questions? First of all, is there any intention to have any Irish involvement in monitoring events in the Ukraine? And if so, could the Minister expand on that, please? I'm just wondering, in relation to the run-up to this, the extent that the advice from maybe eastern states in the EU was sought, because they clearly would have a greater understanding of the sensitivities of the area than the EU states in this part of Europe. And I'm just wondering about that. And can the Minister say anything in relation to the whole question of economic sanctions? Because it looks like the effective response, if there is to be one, it would be in that sort of area. But I mean, clearly there would be loss on both sides if such a road was gone down. And has thought been given to that whole issue? Thank you.
Thank you. Deputy Daly, a minute.
I think the quick response of the EU in relation to the Russian authorities' breach of international law is actually, while welcome, in very, very sharp contrast with the approach to the illegal invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq from the US authorities, and indeed Israel's role in terms of Palestine, and that point will not have been missed. NATO have a role to play in this going back over the past period. In reality, NATO has had an undisguised ambition to continue what is in effect 2 decades of expansion into the post-Soviet territory. And we have to see these issues in the background, and I think it would be very foolish for the Irish government in a neutral country to very rapidly align itself, if you like, with the new opposition inside of the Ukraine. Behind all of this is economic vested interests, privatisation and big companies such as Chevron and so on. People, be it on the western side or on the Russian-speaking side of the Ukraine, are being equally afflicted by these harsh economic policies, and the solution to these issues will come from them themselves, not from being used as puppets by big multinational corporations for their own goal. And we, as an independent, neutral country, should be respecting and facilitating that by not doing things or not supporting the EU in their own goals, external goals, if you like, which in reality are destabilising the situation for the Ukrainian people.
Thank you, Minister. 2 minutes.